History versus fiction. How does history differ from fiction? It's an important question to ask, since we naturally think of gaming as something that's closer to fiction. We've seen so far that by combining narrative and analysis, historians use evidence to strengthen claims to accurately represent the facts about the true past. They use an objective voice and third-person perspective to create reality effects, and their representations range across time and space, changing scale from micro to macro, as they seek to explain the causes of change over time. Working in this way, historians claim history's both construction and reconstruction, that it's both empirical and literary, and historians acknowledge what they write is always more than just its evidentiary base. That is, what they write goes beyond the sources. It involves inference, it involves imaginative work, and it involves interpretation. And now, if that's the case, and history involves the imagination, critics have asked how it really differs from fiction. Postmodern critics argue ultimately there is no clear divide, and that history and fiction exist along something more like a spectrum. So no good history is purely based on facts, since it always depends on interpretation to flesh out the sources. Historians go way beyond the documentary evidence, and they infer meaning around those sources. Similarly, novelists often employ reality effects in their writings. For example, they reconstruct particular historical moments that appear realistic, even if there is no direct evidence for the characters that inhabit those scenes or the actions that they undertake. The difference is that novelists don't pretend that the world that they create actually existed, while historians do. So these are different conventions, as a result of which the audience learns to see the truth claims of the historian and the novelist quite differently. Even so, the two genres do converge in the way the past is represented in text. So one example is narration. Historians use narrative, not purely argument. They tell stories. Sure, histories often appear mostly or partly as non-narrative, as they make arguments or test theses. The story is necessarily partial, but all histories implicitly see the past as something that can be told like a story. Overall, what recent literary criticisms of history have done is to undermine the view of history as referring to one true past, and to underline views of it as a set of representations of the past that are as true as possible. What difference does it make that history is usually represented in textual form? Historians themselves often avoid asking these kinds of questions. It is, of course, possible to study histories as text, but historians still today tend mainly to evaluate historical writings for their reliability, for the cogency of their arguments, for their consistency with existing interpretations, and not for the rhetorical devices that they use in the way that perhaps a literary scholar might analyze a text. Now, this leaves us a lot of room for discussion as to how history might be visualized in forms other than a text. In an enlarged approach to historical representation, visuals could provide a vehicle for the narrative or argument referring to the past, not purely the word as a symbol on the page. This involves game visuals, doing the imaginative work of the reader. But the game could present a realistic environment, and the gameplay could potentially restrict the player to certain choices and outcomes that were plausible in the past. In effect, that means replaying the past could involve these imaginative leaps, but only those that might not actually be too dissimilar to the kinds that were taken by historians as they constructed representations of the past. So the question is, where on the spectrum between history and fiction will your game sit? What role will text play in your game? And what might be gained or lost by doing the imaginative work of representing the past visually rather than textually for the player? All of these are important considerations as you set about making the past playable.